January 5th, 2025 marked the 30th anniversary of one of the worst disasters in the history of the Seattle Fire Department. 4 firefighters were killed when Martin Pang set fire to his family's frozen food warehouse to collect insurance money. I'm King 5's Natalie Swaby. Join us as we remember the fire that claimed 4 lives and triggered an international manhunt. January 5th, 1995.
On that day, 4 families' lives changed forever.
For Seattle, it was a scene so devastating.
There was just an outpouring of sadness and I think outrage as well.
4 firefighters lost their lives after one man intentionally set this fire.
Mr. Pang, how do you plead?
Guilty. It was a story of greed and death and international political intrigue.
It was an important moment in the history of the Seattle Fire Department.
It all unfolded on a day when Brian Hastings was on duty.
That we ironically happened to all be together and we took a picture.
Hastings says this photo was taken around 1 p.m., showing firefighter James Brown, Lieutenant Walt Kilgore, firefighter Randy Terlicker, and Lieutenant Greg Shoemaker right beside Hastings, who 6 hours later was among the firefighters rushing in to help those 4.
I was a lieutenant on an engine company and we responded on the second alarm.
The emergency call came in for a fire at the Mary Pang's food products warehouse. It turned out to be a tragic event that former King 5 investigator Linda Byron covered extensively.
The firefighters that came to the scene were fighting the fire, they thought, on one level. It was a terrible mistake. No one realized that the building had a basement.
So we arrived about 3 minutes before the collapse.
So they rushed to get out. All of them don't get out. 4 of them fall to their deaths.
There was the intense grief and the investigation into the son of the warehouse's owners, Martin Pang.
Martin Pang told his ex-wife that he was going to do this, that he was going to burn down the warehouse for insurance money. And she reported it to the authorities. During the month of December, they had surveillance on the building and nothing happened, so they pulled the surveillance off.
After the January fire, there was a manhunt for Martin Pang, who had fled to Brazil.
He was in the clubs, he was out on the beaches, and people began to recognize him.
Pang's arrest followed, and at that time, King 5's Linda Byron traveled to Brazil, where he was detained in a concrete cell and got the exclusive interview.
Why Brazil?
Well, there's supposed to be no extradition from Brazil, and I figured that the dust would settle, the truth would come out.
This was arson, but 4 people died. He's charged with felony murder. And Brazil says, wait a minute, that's not a crime in our country. They said, we will not send him back to face trial for murder. The King County prosecutors had to go in and amend the charges.
Pang was sentenced for manslaughter and arson.
There'll never be a personal closure. There'll always be that big hole.
The court handed down a punishment of 35 years in prison.
105 months on each count.
Pang was released after serving 23 years.
All these things are hurtful, painful to victims of crime, and we were all victims. The whole city was a victim of that crime. We just had to forgive and move on, learn from our mistakes.
Hastings, a lieutenant 30 years ago and the assistant chief of operations today, says after what happened here, the Seattle Fire Department made major changes.
The first is to understand what the situation is that you're in, and to that end we do a 360, which means we get a lap around the building.
He says they rely on plans about the type of structure they're dealing with, the history of the building, and they do an analysis of fires.
We're trying to remind people these are the gaps that we've seen at fires, and this is the correction we're going to make.
For the department, it's about the lessons learned and the 4 firefighters they'll always remember.
You know, it's a painful thing, and you got to just slowly let time do some of the healing. The objective is to not have it happen again.
Coming up, we revisit the fire that claimed the lives of 4 firefighters and the effort to bring justice to their families. The 1995 warehouse fire in the Chinatown International District sparked a manhunt that ultimately ended in Brazil and prompted legislation from lawmakers that they hoped would save lives. The following is King 5's coverage of the deadly fire and the efforts to capture the man responsible.
The first alarm sounds at 7:02. Firefighters arrive on the scene to find flames shooting through the roof of the Mary Pang warehouse. fire is worse than expected. 7-Eleven, the second alarm is called in. Firefighters begin attacking the blaze from inside the building and on the roof. At 7:30, the 4 missing firefighters are last seen. At that point, the fire department says they have 1/2 hour's worth of oxygen in their tanks. The fire is bad. At 7:32, the third alarm is called in. Work continues inside. Firefighters begin to get the upper hand against the flames. Then tragedy. At approximately 7:40, there's an explosion. Some firefighters are seen leaving the building. The alarm to get out is sounded. But 4 firefighters are trapped inside. The floor has collapsed into the basement. The rescue is then on.
We sent crews back in to look for them at great risk. It was dangerous, but we had to do that. But then it got to the point where the roof was collapsing, and we didn't want to jeopardize any more firefighters.
5 minutes after the explosion, at approximately 7:45, the 4th alarm is sounded. The blaze worsens. The fire department pulls out all the stops to save the missing firefighters. 8:05, the 5th alarm sounds. By this time, 100 firefighters are on the scene. The battle continues for another 5 hours. Finally, at 1 o'clock in the morning, the fire is contained.
It began as a routine fire call Thursday night, just shortly after 7. But within minutes of the firefighters' arrival at the scene, it became very clear that the fire at the Mary Pang warehouse in Seattle was anything but routine. The fire kept growing larger. More trucks were called in. More than 100 firefighters attacked the building from all sides. But then an alarm sounded, warning firefighters to leave the building. All but 4 made it out. The victims trapped under a collapsed floor inside the burning building were Lieutenant Walter Kilgore, Lieutenant Gregory Shoemaker, firefighter James Brown, and Randall Terlicker.
Fire department chaplain had been dispatched, and so it looks like an awful situation. It's really terrible to lose brave firefighters anytime, and it just seems senseless and sad.
Rescue crews were sent in to save the trapped firefighters, but were forced back by flames. As the night wore on, it became apparent that the 4 men had truly made the ultimate sacrifice.
This is the most devastating tragedy that has ever hit the Seattle Fire Department.
Once the fire was out, teams were sent back into the warehouse to find the bodies of each man. Over the next 2.5 days, the bodies were recovered, each time being brought out in a solemn ceremony with co-workers saluting their fallen friends. The investigation into what sparked this fatal fire is now underway inside what's left of the warehouse. Federal and local agencies have joined together to pinpoint a cause, and the city of Seattle is coming together in grief to pay tribute to 4 heroes.
Investigators are climbing through piles of evidence at the fire scene. Literally, no piece of charred debris is being left unturned in search of the cause of the blaze that killed 4 firefighters.
Officially, yes, we are classifying it right now as a suspicious fire. We cannot prove that it's arson. We cannot prove that it's accidental.
It will be days before investigators determine if someone set the fire. At a news conference this afternoon, they explained questions linger about the building's structure.
Yes, it's very clear that there was a very early structural collapse within the building. We are looking at that very, very closely right now, and we have some very definite opinions as to what may have occurred, but until we have confirmation from structural engineers and some other people, we can't confirm that either.
Why did the floor collapse so soon, swallowing up the firefighters in this gaping hole? No one knows for sure. Investigators also revealed today a bakery, La Panzanella, occupied the warehouse's bottom floor. Investigators won't comment on where they believe the fire started. They say because both businesses were open last Thursday, fire crews had to search the building for occupants.
Business was open and being conducted within an hour of the fire. There was nothing on the part of anybody to have reason not to go in that building and consider it safe.
The cause of the fire at the Mary Pang warehouse is arson.
And now the fire investigation becomes a murder investigation. Homicide detectives are tracking down several solid leads on just who torched the frozen food warehouse last week, killing 4 Seattle firefighters.
This investigation is going to take time. We would love to be able to conclude it today, but that is not possible.
Investigators confirmed that someone had threatened to burn down the Pangs warehouse and that for a while the International District building was under surveillance. But that was called off when nothing panned out. Also tonight, we know more about just what happened during the fire that sent the floor crashing out from under firefighters. The flames found a hidden weakness in one of the walls, and it gave way early on in the blaze.
It began to deteriorate, and it eventually collapsed. That allowed one whole section of floor to drop fairly quickly.
Among the questions for detectives, did the arsonist know about the weak wall, or was it just consumed in the fire that killed Walt Kilgore, Greg Shoemaker, Randy Terlicker, and James Brown?
The best way to honor these 4 fallen heroes is to bring the killer or killers to justice. And I hope that anyone with any information about this fire, no matter how big or small, will come forward.
Tonight, Seattle homicide detectives are plugging away, tracking down leads they hope will lead them to whoever deliberately started the killer fire at the Mary Pangs warehouse in the International District. While police say an arrest is not imminent, Chief Norm Stamper tells me investigators have some solid clues.
You have a direction to go in. It's not just starting from scratch.
We're certainly not starting from scratch, but we have a lengthy investigation in front of us, and we're going to do it right.
Now that fire investigators have officially ruled the fire arson, that means Walt Kilgore, Greg Shoemaker, Randy Terlicker, and James Brown were murdered. The fire department is now confirming that someone had threatened to burn down the Mary Pangs warehouse, and that for a while, weeks before the fire, the building was being staked out, but the surveillance was called off.
It wasn't under surveillance the night of the fire, and I can't give you the specific time that it stopped. It stopped because we had nothing had materialized to make us think that this was a valid threat.
Harris says crews at the scene the night of the fire were told about the arson threats, but the firefighters were apparently unaware of the full nature of the building's layout. The warehouse, with its high ceilings and heavy post beams, had been remodeled several times. During the last renovation, a thin wooden wall was added to the building's lower level. That wall gave way early on in the fire, causing the floor to collapse.
It began to deteriorate, and it eventually collapsed. That allowed one whole section of floor to drop fairly quickly.
Many believe the 4 firefighters trapped inside the burning warehouse in the International District had little chance of survival. But lives may have been saved if a sprinkler system had been in place inside the old building. And time again, we've seen the destruction. In September, 25 residents at this apartment fire in Seattle managed to escape, but their homes burned. There was no sprinkler system. In Bellingham a year ago, 2 Department of Transportation buildings went up in flames. Important files and expensive equipment was destroyed. Neither of the buildings had sprinklers.
An editorial.
Now lawmakers are trying to find solutions. Senator Jean Cole has introduced legislation that would create a committee to look at retrofitting older buildings with the proper sprinkler equipment.
New buildings of certain sizes are covered, but a lot of our older buildings, which likely are more unsafe, are not required to have sprinklers.
But the cost for retrofitting older buildings can be expensive. Estimates for older high-rise structures range from $200,000 to $400,000 per building or more. Cole does not want to put this type of burden on building owners alone.
So I think we need to address it and take the responsibility among all of us, not just the building owners.
At least 12 Los Angeles-based alcohol, tobacco, and firearms agents are scouring the L.A. area looking for Martin Pang. They will not confirm if there is an outstanding federal warrant for him, but then again, they are not saying if there isn't.
In Los Angeles, we're following different leads and whatnot. Right now, we're attempting to find Martin Pang.
Why?
We want to talk to him for some questioning.
Pang is the son of the owners of the International District warehouse that burned to the ground in a deliberately set fire back in January. 4 Seattle firefighters died in the blaze.
We've been looking for him since Monday here in the LA area, checking former associates and friends and things like that.
Investigative sources confirm they have been looking for Pang for at least a week, and agents were expected to interview the manager of this apartment where Pang lived for several months last year. The woman says she fears retribution and does not want to be identified.
You frightened by him?
Well, I would be after an interview, yes, definitely. I feel he's capable of doing somebody harm if they got in his way.
Meanwhile, in Seattle, detectives work at building their case.
We are working aggressively. We do have a significant number of detectives fully assigned to this case. Obviously, the magnitude of the case is very great.
Brazilian authorities caught up to Pang at Rio's famed Copacabana Beach. Authorities say they had been watching him and were just waiting for an arrest warrant to be signed. It seems Pang apparently unknowingly led the police to himself. His phone calls to the United States were traced. Tonight, Pang is in a Rio de Janeiro jail. He is facing 4 counts of murder. He is alleged to have had his parents' frozen food warehouse burned down back in January. 4 Seattle firefighters were killed in the blaze.
From everyone in the fire department, we're very pleased and we're hoping that he will be brought back and justice will prevail.
Martin Pang, reputed playboy, one-time race car driver, sometimes actor, has been the focus of one of the most intense manhunts in Seattle history. Just today, Pang's picture was put in Brazil's national newspaper. From Seattle to Los Angeles to Brazil, Pang had managed to stay one step ahead of the law until tonight.
Given the magnitude of the case, the loss of 4 firefighters, in the history that I'm aware of, this is one of the largest manhunts that have gone on, and it's been successful. He has been taken into custody, and we're very hopeful that this prosecution goes forward successfully.
In Washington, D.C. tonight, Seattle Mayor Norm Rice, who personally vowed a thorough investigation, reacts to news of the arrest.
This is important, and I'm very pleased that we at least have closed this chapter with an arrest, and now we can pursue justice and make sure that justice can be served, especially for all the families who suffered so much under this great tragedy.
It is still not clear what will happen next to Martin Pang. Brazilian authorities say he could either be extradited or deported to the United States. We are told one process is faster than the other.
Martin Pang fled to Brazil to escape 4 counts of felony first-degree murder, and tonight it appears he succeeded. 9 months after Pang's arrest in Rio de Janeiro, the Brazilian Supreme Court has decided to return Pang to Seattle with one major condition, that he be tried only for arson. Sources say Pang confessed to the FBI that he set the fire at his parents' warehouse, a fire that killed 4 Seattle firefighters. But under Brazilian law, Pang can't be charged with murder unless he intended to kill. Journalist Barbara Cornell covered today's hearing in Brasilia.
The bottom line is that when Martin Pang returns to Seattle to stand trial, he will be returning to stand trial for the charge of first-degree arson. The Supreme Court today rejected the 4 charges of first-degree homicide.
We are certainly disappointed that the court has limited the appropriate label that can be applied to this case. Under Washington law, this is murder. Under Brazilian law, it appears that it is arson.
The King County prosecuting attorney says he will still try to send Martin Pang to prison for the rest of his life, but it will be much harder to do on an arson charge.
I am convinced that justice is going to be done in this case and that we can prevail and that we can get an exceptional sentence. But you're right. It does make it tougher.
As for the defense, they'd hoped for even more conditions.
We were disappointed that in Brazil, you can't serve more than 30 years for any offense. It's in the Constitution. And under the extradition laws, we were hoping that that would be implemented in this process, in this extradition process. At the same time, they're not extraditing for murder charges is very helpful to us.
Families and friends of the 4 firefighters, there are simply no words to convey to you the remorse that I feel. I want you to know that I take full responsibility for my actions. My actions were wrong, and if I could exchange places with any of them, I would in an instant.
With those words, Martin Pang apologized for setting the fire at his parents' frozen food warehouse, an act that took 4 firefighters' lives. Mary and Harry Pang were in court to support their son, even though he allegedly set their warehouse on fire to collect their insurance money. Pang's actions enraged the community. When he fled to Brazil and the government there would only send him back on arson charges, the anger intensified until it was unleashed today in the courtroom.
I have to spend the rest of my life without my father. He should have been sentenced to die, preferably tied to a wooden stake and set fire. Only then would he have known the hell my father must have gone through. Martin Pang, you ripped my heart from me that awful night. You cheated Greg and I out of our life together. You cheated my daughters from having a father, all because of your selfishness.
He gambled with the lives of innocent people for his own financial gain. To me, that makes him not only an arsonist, but a murderer. If a firefighter has one single enemy, it's an arsonist.
I am haunted each day by the horrific way in which he died. To envision a loved one falling into a fiery inferno, only to survive and take his last breath 12 minutes later.
I would like Martin Pang to be able to see that grave. It is a very real picture of the result of his choices. In setting this fire, Martin Pang committed an evil act.
The family of these men, as well as countless friends and co-workers, will always carry grief in their hearts because of the greed of Martin Pang. And for myself, I am no longer a mother. I'll never be a grandmother. My life has changed forever due to the greed of one man.
In the end, the judge went along with the plea bargain deal of 35 years for 4 counts of manslaughter.
Therefore, it's the judgment of this court that you receive 105 months on each count to run consecutively.
The fallen firefighter memorial sits in Pioneer Square, inspired by 4 Seattle firefighters who died battling a warehouse fire in Seattle's International District in 1995. Walter Kilgore, Gregory Shoemaker, James Brown, and Randall Terlicker fell to their deaths in the basement when the floor of the Pang warehouse collapsed. Investigators ruled it an arson.
It was huge. I mean, 4 firefighters were killed. It's the worst disaster in the history of the Seattle Fire Department.
Retired Seattle homicide detective Cloyd Steiger was part of the task force to track down the person responsible. They soon zeroed in on Martin Pang, whose family owned the building. The motive? The insurance money.
I believe that Martin Pang is a psychopath and a narcissist. He was all about himself and gratification, considered himself a playboy, a player.
Pang fled to Brazil, a country that didn't have an extradition treaty with the U.S. King 5 reporter Linda Byron went to Rio de Janeiro and landed an exclusive interview.
I've been judged and already tried in the eyes of the media and the public, and it's not fair.
I came to conclude that Martin Pang was a spoiled, entitled, rich kid who was used to living the good life and wanted more of it, and he was seeing a future where he might not have it.
Brazil refused to extradite Pang to face murder charges. Authorities considered extreme measures to get him back to face justice.
We had meetings at the FBI when this was going on and openly discussed kidnapping him off the streets in Rio and dragging him over to Uruguay, where we had an extradition treaty, and doing that. It was openly discussed and seriously considered.
In the end, he returned to Seattle to face 4 counts of manslaughter.
Mr. Pang, how do you plead?
Guilty.
Today, the Pang warehouse is just a hole in the ground. After serving 20 years of a 35-year sentence, Pang will soon be a free man.
It's going to always feel that it's unfair because those firefighters were given a life sentence by Martin Pang. They lost their lives.
Asked about Pang's release, Seattle Fire remained silent and steadfast.